English translation. 350th contact. Monday, 1st December 2003, 14:57 hours.
Oh, I am so glad you came here today. Be warmly welcomed, my friend.
Be greeted, dear friend. It is a pleasure to see you well. I am also to greet you very affectionately from everyone. And Florina sends you a message through me that, as her fatherly friend, she thanks you once again expressly for the advice telepathically transmitted to her.
For her thanks, I would like to thank her in return.
That will please her. But I would not like to miss the opportunity to express my thanks to you in the same wise, because your advice to Florina not only confirmed mine, but also complemented it considerably. And when I speak of expressing my thanks to you in the same wise, I am thinking of our very precious friendship, and of the fact that you have many characteristics which were also characteristic of my father and friend Svath. You have learned a lot from him, and you use what you have learned.
Thank you, but that was the purpose of the teaching and the instruction. But while you are here, I would like to ask you about something I talked about with Wolfgang last night. Do you have some time to go into it?
Actually, I just came here for a short greeting visit and to bring you some work that we ask you to do. But I still feel the need to answer your questions.
Of course I will do the work. If it is urgent, I will finish it as soon as possible. But if it is a miracle of completion, I will do it immediately. But I also have a question about that. Ptaah manipulated my computer, and Quetzal helped him with that. But I do not know what exactly was done. But for security reasons, it was all about this. If I do work for you and enter a certain password in this context, then everything I write is not saved and not transferred to our server, but immediately printed out by the printer, and then immediately deleted again. I would like to ask Quetzal and Ptaah if it would be better if everything would be saved. He could arrange it so that only I would have access to the data.
You can rest assured because Ptaah and Quetzal have taken care of the storage of the data. They have thought of it themselves, which is why they have created a tiny transmitter that allows everything to be recorded and held in our monitoring disk.
Ah, that is interesting news again, because I did not know anything about the whole thing.
Today I was supposed to inform you about it in the 2 tasks, but you beat me to it with your question. They first wanted to check everything regarding the proper function over a longer period of time. Now they are sure that everything is working correctly and flawlessly.
And when did they handle all this?
You were not present when they did the manipulations. To my knowledge, you were out shopping with Ava and your daughter Selena Mercedes. But it has been more than a year.
Aha, it happens all the time, day or night, that one of you is in my office. I always notice this when the chair is moved or the computer is turned on, when I come back into my office. The CD player is also used and all kinds of music are listened to. Maybe they even make phone calls, maybe to Era or something. Sometimes you can also smell quite lovely scents in the office, which I suppose can be traced back to some of the lovely girls.
We all feel very comfortable in your workroom, but also in the whole area around the center, where we often go for a walk or a stroll and enjoy it.
And what about our people when they are out on the grounds, such as on the night watch?
That means no more difficulties for us, neither by day nor by night. Our security devices and camouflage equipment have been developed in such a serviceable manner that we can also move in the immediate vicinity of the group members during the day without being noticed by them. However, we may be heard walking around if we are not wearing footwear that muffles the sound of footsteps. Also, certain sensitive group members may be able to perceive our swinging waves when we are sufficiently close to them. However, none of us use your telephones because we would not know who to call. However, Several of us have already thought that through these devices, we could call you in the living quarters if one of us is here in your workroom and wants to speak to you. But we did not dare to do so, because if someone other than you were to make the connection through the apparatus, we would not know what to do. But the whole thing would also be just a joke on our part.
Yes, what, so, you want to have fun with this? Look, if you want to, you can have it, because I am good at talking by phone instead of telepathically. But you are good, my friend, because if someone other than me picks up the talking bone and answers, then you do not have to speak anything and you can just hang up the phone again, which will break the connection. And if you really want to call me by phone instead of telepathically or loudly, then look here. Just dial 310 here and press the speaker button here. To switch off again, just press the speaker button again.
The procedure is known to us.
Good. Then I can now put forward my question?
Yes.
Thank you. It is about all the strange machinations around me in relation to the authorities, the judges, the police, and many people who knew me in my teenage years. I would like to talk about that openly, at least as far as I can remember. The details I do not remember anyway. However, I can still bring everything together roughly, so that we can record it in our conversation report in order to create clarity. I still have to say that both Svath and Asket were always helpful to me in the time I want to talk about. Often I was also longer times with Svath as well as with Asket, when I was on the run again. So then, everything actually began with the experience when I saw the first beamship ship with Father. Stupidly, I told our neighbor Horathshek about it, who was only called Horath, who of course could not keep his mouth shut and carried everything to his wife, who was known as Nagging Horathin. The very same day she came at me and drooled that I was a liar, and that she would drive me out of my silly nonsense and get me to stop lying and to denounce me to the town clerk Gattaker. And in order not to lose any time, she immediately began to put her anger into action by giving me a resounding slap in the face. From then on, I could no longer walk past the neighboring house when the woman was outside, because as soon as she saw me, she ran to beat me up. She also passed this behavior on to my two brothers Gottlieb and Karl, who received an enormous beating from her. Of course, this did not exactly contribute to my mother's joy, so she went straight to the neighboring house and called the Horathin out of the house. When my mother confronted her, it came to fisticuffs, and the nagging Horathin took a blow like she had probably never received such a blow in her life before. This, however, led to the Horathshek's wicked hostility towards our family, and in the end, the justice of the peace had to be called in, but he took the side of the Horathin. Mother and father also had to face Gattaker, the town clerk, who also sided with the Horathsheks and especially targeted me and called me an uneducated man, for whom he would stitch and patch up the seams. And indeed he denigrated me all around and got the school board, the youth welfare office and the whole local council behind him, who harassed me enormously. At school, too, I felt everything, especially through my teacher Hans Frey, who more and more often treated me with a lengthwise glued blackthorn beating, which ultimately led to me playing hooky for more than 170 days and staying longer and longer with Svath. Then one day the nagging Horathin ambushed me in a threshing floor and hit me with full force with a soaking wet linen towel right in my face, which hurt very badly. With presence of mind, as they say, I tore the towel out of her hand, and she was so surprised that she let go of it without resistance, and I was able to hit her in the face as well before I left. She drooled after me in rage and screamed, as I can still remember, that she would now have me taken care of. And that was the beginning of what I want to talk about. And somehow I do not have a past since this story with the Horathin, because when people ask about me and my youth and young manhood, nobody wants to know anything about it. That was also the case when the Tagesanzeiger journalist who wrote the book, Meyer, Prophet, wanted to make inquiries about me. Everything that happened was denied by the authorities and the police, but also by private individuals, including my former schoolmates. Also, Gary Kinder, the American who wrote the book Light Years about me, did not obtain any information during his investigations. In fact, certain things were vehemently denied. For example, Professor Russley from Rheinau, to whom the Bulach authorities had me transferred to in order to get me out of circulation, is said never to have existed. Similarly, the Bulach authorities denied that they had taken me to Gondeswil in the Emmental, canton of Bern, as a hired boy to a rabid farmer who beat me. I got up at 4:30 in the morning and had to work hard all day, because I was not allowed to go to school. Bedtime was then between 22 hours and 23 hours. Of course, I did not like that and took a hike. When the police got hold of me again weeks later, they put me into a pig fattening dairy and cheese factory in Sarnen in the canton of Obwalden, where I had to slave away as a boy just like an adult, and where they wanted to mold me into the Arch-Catholic faith. Of course I did not like that, so I set off on the journey again. Of course I was picked up by the police again after weeks, and taken to a large pig fattening, cheese and dairy in Weggis, Lucerne, where I had to feed and fatten 420 pigs twice a day together with an old farmhand. Bring the milk together twice a day for 15 kilometers by bicycle and trailer, and drag the 50 liters of milk churns around by myself. I also had to wash the cheese every day and turn the very heavy wheels alone, which demanded more than my last strength. And because I went out everywhere and went on hikes, the authorities in Bulach found it necessary to admit me to the Albisbrunn youth home near Hausen am Albis, where I learned to make toys in the toy carpentry workshop. But even at this place there was a ruthless supervisor, for whom the beating was more important than some humanity. So I took the slipper dash again and went wandering. Afterwards I came to the Nabenheim Sellnau in the city of Zurich, where I liked it very much and where I learned to turn wood and repair antique furniture. The supervisors were all decent people who could not be accused of anything in regard to the treatment of the inmates. I was also able to move freely in the city and also to carry out foreign work assignments, despite my young age. But exactly this did not suit the authorities in Bulach. So one day they had me taken away by the police and brought to Brüttisellen near Dietlikon, ZH, and of course to a boys' home, which had its own large nursery, where I had to work from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Over lunchtime there was 1 hour of food and rest. But even there the responsible people were sometimes extremely violent and gave out beatings. Also, during the summertime, work in the garden was only allowed with the upper body exposed, which had serious consequences. Water sprayers were set up in the garden for irrigation, which were in operation for hours due to the heat of the day, which is why one was hit by the sprayed water again and again during work. As a result, the sun heated up the water drops on the back and damaged the skin, creating large blisters that filled with scorching water. And as this went on day after day, the blisters became inflamed and began to fester when they burst. So, my whole back was one big, sore spot of pus, but nothing was done about it, because it was simply said that you were soft and did not want to work. So I took the consequences again and set off on a march to somewhere, but finally ended up at home, because my festering back needed the help my mother gave me. Of course, the authorities were aware of this. They immediately let the police go and hide me somewhere in a home again. But when the policeman saw my maltreated back, he took pity on me and reported to the authorities that I first had to recover, which after a good 4 weeks was ready. Then I was picked up again and taken to the Aarburg Fortress, a former castle on a rock high above the town of Aarburg, an escape-proof building with individual cells in which the inmates were locked up at night. So now I was finally safely housed and could no longer flee. At least that was the opinion of the Bulach authorities. The rocks fell steeply, and all the windows were barred, except for those of the kitchen, where it was apparently unnecessary because of the high and very steep rock face. Because probably no one was crazy and tired of life enough to escape down this rock face. Because the only possibility was to break all the bones or to go straight to heaven or hell. Well, Always crazy enough to do the craziest thing, I climbed up on the sink in an unobserved moment and escaped through the open window, which I quickly closed behind me. As fast as I could, I set off on the breakneck descent, which I managed happily, and disappeared. Several months later, I went back home to Muncheltorf, ZH, where my parents and siblings now lived, because father had sold the house in Niederflachs-Bülach, and everyone had moved. Of course, the police showed up again one day, but no longer to take me with them, but to inform me that the Bülach authorities would change their strategy and offer me a land service in the Ehrli near Höbli, Obiwald, ZH, where I could work for a wage. I agreed to this, and a few days later I set off to take up employment. The peasants consisted of the farmer, the farmer's wife, and an older son, who were also served by an old farmhand. Apart from farming, which also included some fattening pigs, a sawmill was also run, which was put into operation by water power from the sawmill pond. At first, everything went well, and the master craftsman and the son were friendly. But only until I had learned the sawing trade and could handle everything independently. Besides the fact that I still had to feed and muck out the pigs and cattle and help with the forest work. For all the work, the food was very meager, so I secretly, like the old farmhand, kept to the oatmeal flakes that stood in sacks in the camp and were used for fattening the pigs. And the wages were fantastic because for the whole mess there was 15 a month, and suddenly also a beating, when the ever-increasing work could no longer be done, but still had to be done from 04 Chao to 22 hour, or even 23 Xuan, while the master craftsman sat in the warm room, listening to the radio and enjoying wine or cider. So one day I set off again, and at the age of 16, looked for work in Feraltorf, ZH, with the construction company Müller, where I earned 95 per hour as an assistant. This was the end of the Bülach authorities' intrigue, because from then on there was no longer any attempt to hire me out or hide somewhere. But this was nothing more than only the calm before the storm.
I know all this, but go on because it is interesting for me to hear everything from your mouth.
Well, I had just turned 16 when I started working for the construction company Müller in Feraltorf, living at home with my parents in Gutenswil, ZH, where they had bought another house when they moved away from Muncheltorf. It was a semi-detached house, attached to 2 other houses. And in the second home with my parents lived also my sister Berta, who was married to a German named Hans Müller, who did not like to work, which unfortunately became clear only after the marriage. Against the advice of Ascot, with whom I had been in contact since 1953, I unfortunately got involved with my brother-in-law, and thus also met 2 of his acquaintances, a certain Kurt Keller, 49 years old, and a young man of little more than 30 years, but whose name I cannot remember. My brother-in-law and the 2 others were together all the time and visited the inns frequently. They often disappeared after visiting the taverns, and did not reappear until hours later, when I was waiting for them in the tavern. Then one day the police suddenly turned up at our place, and all 4 of us were arrested and put in jail. The next day later in the afternoon I was called for an interrogation at the police station and district building in Uster, ZH, where I was accused of being a leader of a professional gang of thieves and of having forced my brother-in-law, Kurt Keller, and the 3rd man to commit all kinds of thefts at gunpoint. Denial was futile, because the other 3 had already confessed everything. The interrogators, how could it have been otherwise, were 2 policemen from Bülach. One brother was a Diedeker, while the other was called Müller, just like my brother-in-law. Of course I said that everything did not correspond to the truth, whereby I described the actual circumstances. But the truth was turned around to such an extent that, as a man under 17, I would have organized everything and, under threat of a pistol, would have forced the 3 much older men to commit the nightly thefts. And since I had nothing wrong to admit, I was still being held in custody while the other 3 were set free until the trial. My dear brother-in-law then used the release to disappear to Germany, never to be seen again. When the court hearing came, I was standing with only the other two before the barriers. The court also read out everyone's sin registers, and it emerged that 49-year-old Kurt Keller had 42 previous convictions for individual and gang theft, fraud, and forgery. The other one was previously clean, while my brother-in-law, who my sister then divorced, was revealed to have been a member of the Hitler Youth. Well, Kurt Keller managed in court to cry with emotion and to play the repentant and the one forced to steal with a pistol by me in such a manner that he was acquitted by a judge who, interestingly enough, came from the district of Bülach. The other man was also acquitted, including my brother-in-law in absentia. On the other hand, I was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Absolutely. This, of course, made me furious, so I disappeared from prison with considerable help from Asket. Months later, I was caught again and transferred to a safer prison, after I had set the cell in Uster Zayach on fire, reducing it to rubble and ashes. As a result, I was taken to the psychiatric hospital in Rheinau, where I was to serve my sentence and be psychiatrically examined. Professor Russley was my assessor, and I was allowed to roam the clinic at night with him, to have discussions with him about creation and the world, or I was allowed to help him to press in hernias and apply compression bandages. Otherwise, one was locked up with the madmen and lunatics in large rooms, and at night in rooms where the windows were also locked with triangular locks. Of course, I felt completely out of place among all the madmen, among whom I had to include the orderlies, because they were obviously also no longer quite sane either. And since there were no tools to open doors or windows, I broke a piece of hardwood out of a wooden footstool, which I scraped with a spoon over a long period of time and formed a triangular key from it. One night, when I went to the toilet before going to bed, I quickly opened the window with it and climbed out, with a depth of 7 meters yawning beneath me, and at the bottom was a concrete slab. Fortunately, as Asket had explained to me days before, with whom I was always in touch, there was a drain pipe from the gutter on the wall of the building, which I shimmed down at least about 2 meters, before the pipe anchorage broke away from the wall and the pipe bent down, and I came to the ground with a major fall after all. Already dark outside, it was easy for me to disappear into the bushes, down to the Rhine, where I slid into the cold water and swam far down the river. The next afternoon, Asket found me marching across a field. I stayed with her for 2 days and made it clear to her that I wanted to get out of Switzerland and into France. So she brought me to the French border near Arlesheim, behind Basel, but I did not tell her what I was up to. Then she left me and was absent for the next months. For my part, I went into the bushes, sneaked across the border and went to the next village, where I went to the gendarmerie and enlisted in the Foreign Legion.
From which you later deserted.
That is right. While the discipline has done me a heck of a lot of good, and I have learned a lot, I could not get used to simply killing people without having to act in real self-defense. So I took off and returned to Switzerland, where I turned myself in to the police, because I thought it was better to be in prison for innocent people than to kill innocent people. No sooner said than done. Back in Switzerland, I turned myself in to the police at the border near Basel. And so I was taken to Regensdorf, where, according to the psychiatric report of Professor Russley, it was decided that I should be released to do a job under supervision. The psychiatry report read something like this: Eduard Meyer has escaped from the Rheinau under life-threatening circumstances, and can apparently not be kept in safe custody. He is in acute danger of risking his life in order to escape, which is why he cannot be held in custody any longer. The man is, this is literally in my memory, above average normal. This expert opinion then led to the Bülach authorities in Wittekon Castle ZH, submitting a special request to Director Demuth, with the question of whether he was willing, as an exception, to accept a young man like me not as a pupil but as a simple worker for the horticultural business, the kitchen scaffolding and the agricultural business. Somehow, I do not know how Professor Russley's request came about, so that I spent 212 years on several walks there, and then went to Bern, where I learned sandblasting in a company on the Wankdorfeldstrasse. After that, my official journeys and adventures in many countries began.
I also know all that, but it does not raise any question.
But still, why does no one want to know about the whole thing today? Why do I not seem to have a past with the authorities and the police, etc.? That is what I want to know, and why I have been treated so badly.
You should leave it alone, because on the one hand you did not suffer any damage from all this, and on the other hand you have learned an incredible amount from it all. My father Svath as well as Asket helped you a lot during your difficult times. Another person would have suffered some sort of psychological or consciousness-based damage. At the least, another person would have fallen into an inferiority complex, would have built up hatred in himself, and would have sought revenge, would have withdrawn or become antisocial, etc. But to explain why you were treated so badly. You explained the whole origin yourself, namely that you told the man Horothshek about the encounter with Svath and his spaceship, which was the trigger for everything. And since the members of the authorities and also certain policemen and judges were very strongly influenced by Horothshek's wife and were prejudiced against you, all the intrigues were decreed about you. That was still the case when you were young, but since then everything has changed. So new rules apply today. You were not the only one who was so badly treated because all over Switzerland such things have happened, and many children and young ones have suffered as a result. Unfortunately, however, many authorities succeeded in destroying the records of their disgrace and erasing all memory of the injustices they had committed, which in some cases happened with the police, as in your case.
Then it is true what Simyase, Asket, and Ketzel said about it, that a spaceship was the origin of it all.
Of course, they would never have told you an untruth. You know we never would have told any untruth.
Sorry, that was not the point of my words either. Just a statement that I was told something that was right.
Then I unfortunately misunderstood you. But now, my friend, it has become later than I actually intended to be here. Farewell, my friend.
Thank you for your patience and time. Goodbye, Ptaah. And thank you again.